Stalin became the totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death in 1924. While the rest of Europe was shattered by the Great Depression, Stalin emphasized advancement in industry and economics. He continued Lenin's new economic policy that allowed private enterprise and ownership in the countryside to provide the amount of food needed for workers in the cities and more to export in exchange for industrial equipment. The NEP government purchased grain and set a certain price to sell it at. The rest of the grain was sold at higher prices at markets. Peasant farmers tried to keep grain off the market, hoping prices would rise. Farmers wouldn't get much profit from the grain they sold, so many didn't want to sell their grain, hoping they could keep it when prices were higher. There was a shortage of grain in the Soviet Union, and the government was worried about how it would be able to feed its expanding workforce. Stalin proposed a new plan for the NEP. He recognized that there weren't enough peasant holdings to produce the amount of grain needed. He placed the fault of the hoarding of grain on the kulaks. Stalin's plan introduced collectivization of agriculture, so enough grain could be produced for food and export. Collectivization was defined as the replacement of private peasant farms with huge state-run and state-owned farms called collectives. This put the production of agriculture under the Communist Party's control, and the old peasants who worked on their own plots of land were free to work in the expanding industrial part of the Soviet Union.
Stalin's solution was to force peasants to give up their individual small plots in favor of larger collective ones. These farms had the potential to be run much more efficiently.
The kulaks were framed as a cause for the poor grain production, and Stalin eliminated the kulaks as a class to intimidate peasants who resisted the idea of collectivization.
The kulaks were bitterly opposed to collectivization. Many burnt their grain and killed their animals to avoid handing them over to the government. In response, Stalin decided to liquidate the kulaks as a social class. 8 million people slaved away in the gulags, where the annual death rate was 20%. Life here was appalling. Inmates had to work and sleep outside in the Siberian winter and were fed only scraps of food.
The new Communist Party also went against the traditional religion in Russia of Eastern Orthodoxy during their period of collectivization. All members of the church, Jewish rabbis, Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, and Muslim mullahs were attacked as equally harshly, and churches were destroyed. Here's a look at how the amount of collective farms increased from 1928 to 1938, and how the dependence of the agriculture industry on these collective farms grew during this decade. The change from individual peasant farms transitioned dramatically to collective farms from 1928 to 1940. Stalin moved to a position of increased industrialization against the peasants, but with terror in the countryside and economic dislocation, Stalin was scared that he was losing control and rival powers would emerge against him. Stalin forced the Bukharin off the Politburo. From his lust for power, the great purges emerged. Sergei Kirov was assassinated on December 1st, 1934. Thousands of people were arrested and taken to labor camps during the shooting. It is not known for sure who ordered the assassination of Kirov, but scholars believe that Stalin was afraid of Kirov and he ordered the assassination. The purges started after the assassination of Kirov. Many former Soviet leaders were held on public trials in Moscow and executed. Lower-level party members of the Bukharin were tried in private and executed. Millions of citizens were also executed or deported without a trial. Stalin used these purges to gain discipline and control, but he soon became distrustful of his Central Party elite. The Great Purges were one of the most mysterious and horrendous political events in history. By the 1930s, the Communist Party controlled about 97% of the farms in the Soviet Union. Producers on collective farms had no input on deciding what crops to grow or how much to sell them for. Millions of peasant lives were lost, but the initial problem of food shortages was not solved.